During World War II, thousands of German prisoners of war were held in camps across the United States. Their treatment was governed by the 1920 Geneva Convention, which required adequate food, housing, and medical care for captured soldiers. American authorities generally followed these standards, both as a legal obligation and in the expectation that German forces would apply similar treatment to American prisoners. Daily life in many of these camps was structured but stable. Prisoners were housed in barracks, assigned work details, and provided regular meals. Because the war created severe labor shortages in agriculture and industry, many German prisoners were sent to work on farms, in canneries, and in other essential operations. Their labor was compensated according to established rates, with earnings issued in camp scrip that could be used for approved purchases. Food became one of the most noticeable differences between what many prisoners expected and what they experienced. By the later years of the war, shortages and rationing had affected large parts of Europe. Civilians and soldiers alike faced limited access to meat, sugar, and fresh produce. In contrast, the United States, while also using rationing systems, maintained a comparatively strong agricultural supply. Prisoner of war camps were required to provide rations comparable to those given to American troops stationed domestically. As a result, meals in American camps often included items that had become rare in wartime Germany. Bread was served regularly, along with vegetables, soups, and when available, meat. On certain occasions, prisoners were also given desserts prepared in camp kitchens. These could include cakes or sweet-baked goods made from available ingredients. Such food was not presented as luxury, but as part of standard meal planning within the limits of supply. Beverages also reflected regional availability. Coca-Cola, already widely distributed in the United States before and during the war, was sometimes accessible through camp canteens or special distributions. Prisoners could purchase drinks and small comforts using their scrip, subject to camp regulations. For men who had lived through years of scarcity, access to sweetened beverages was unfamiliar. Accounts from former prisoners describe moments when these foods carried emotional weight. The experience of tasting cake or drinking a sweet soda after prolonged deprivation could prompt strong reactions. These responses were not always about the specific items themselves, but about the contrast between expectations of harsh imprisonment and the reality of regulated, comparatively stable conditions. American policy toward German prisoners of war was shaped in part by reciprocity. Officials believed that visible compliance with international standards would strengthen demands for proper treatment of American personnel held by Germany. This approach did not eliminate hardship, confinement, or the uncertainty faced by prisoners, but it did influence daily living conditions in measurable ways. The presence of familiar consumer products, such as Coca-Cola, also reflected broader aspects of American society during the war. Despite mobilization and rationing, industrial production remained high, and certain goods continued to circulate widely. For prisoners who had been exposed to years of propaganda portraying the United States as economically strained and socially unstable, these details could challenge prior assumptions. After the war, some former prisoners recalled that small moments, including shared meals or access to ordinary consumer goods, stood out in memory. These recollections did not erase the reality of captivity, separation from family, or the broader violence of the conflict. They did, however, illustrate how daily material conditions in American camps differed from what many prisoners had anticipated. The contrast between expectation and experience formed part of a larger pattern reported by German prisoners held in the United States. Within the constraints of wartime detention, camp life was organized to meet international standards and in some cases to demonstrate a model of compliance. Food, work, and limited access to consumer items were all elements of that system, and they shaped how prisoners understood their circumstances during and after the war. In addition to food and basic supplies, structured routines shaped daily life in the camps. Prisoners followed schedules that included roll calls, work assignments, and designated leisure periods. Recreational activities, such as sports, music, and reading, were permitted within camp regulations. Libraries were established in many locations, and prisoners could receive books and other approved materials through organized channels. Educational programs also operated in a number of camps. Classes were offered in subjects ranging from languages to technical skills, often taught by qualified prisoners themselves. These programs were encouraged in part to maintain order and morale, and in part as preparation for eventual repatriation. Participation varied, but the presence of organized instruction further distinguished camp life from the harsher conditions many prisoners had anticipated. Contact with local civilian populations occurred primarily through supervised work details. Farmers and agricultural managers who relied on prisoner labor often interacted with the men assigned to their fields. While security rules remained in place, these encounters exposed prisoners to everyday aspects of American rural life, including homes, schools, and community routines. Such exposure contributed to a broader understanding of the country beyond official wartime portrayals. The availability of consumer goods in camp canteens was regulated but consistent. Prisoners could use their scrip to purchase items such as soap, writing materials, tobacco, and occasionally packaged food or drinks. These transactions were small in scale, yet they reinforced a sense of predictable routine. For individuals who had experienced displacement, combat, and abrupt capture, predictability itself had value. Reactions to food and drink, including cake and Coca-Cola, must be understood within this broader context. Years of war had altered normal expectations about comfort and scarcity. In Germany, sustained bombing, transportation disruptions, and resource shortages had narrowed daily diets encountering familiar or sweet-tasting items in captivity, could therefore carry psychological significance beyond their nutritional value. Camp authorities monitored morale closely. Reports from the period indicate that maintaining orderly conditions required attention not only to security, but also to basic well-being. Adequate meals, opportunities for work, and limited access to small comforts were considered practical measures to reduce tension and prevent unrest. These policies aligned with international obligations while also serving administrative stability. Not all experiences were uniform. Conditions varied by camp location, available resources, and the phase of the war. Transfers between camps could disrupt routines, and uncertainty about the conflict's outcome weighed heavily on many prisoners. Letters from home when they arrived often brought news of hardship, destruction, or loss. Against that background, even modest stability in daily camp life could stand in sharp contrast. Memories recorded after the war frequently place small sensory details alongside larger historical events. The taste of a sweet drink, the smell of baked goods, or the sight of well-stocked shelves could become fixed reference points in personal recollections. These impressions did not redefine the nature of captivity, but they formed part of how individuals processed an unfamiliar environment. American adherence to the Geneva Convention and the administration of German prisoner of war camps has been documented in military records and post-war analyses. Compliance was not presented as generosity but as policy, shaped by legal obligations and strategic considerations. Within that framework, food distribution, work programs, and controlled access to consumer goods were routine components of camp management. The accounts describing emotional responses to cake or Coca-Cola illustrate how material conditions intersected with expectation. Prisoners who had anticipated severe deprivation sometimes encountered a system that, while restrictive, provided regular meals and limited comforts. The resulting contrast was personal and immediate, even when it did not alter the fundamental reality of detention. These experiences form one part of the broader history of wartime captivity. They reflect the interaction between international law, national policy, and individual perception. Through daily routines that included work, meals, and small purchases, German prisoners in the United States navigated a version of imprisonment that differed in important respects from the image many had carried with them into captivity. The administrative structure of the camps reflected standard military organization. Facilities were overseen by officers and enlisted personnel assigned to guard and supervisory roles, while internal camp order among prisoners was often maintained through designated representatives. This arrangement allowed daily operations to function with a degree of consistency across different locations. Inspections by neutral observers occurred during the war, including visits associated with international oversight of prisoner treatment. These inspections reviewed housing, sanitation, medical care, and food provisions. Reports contributed to an external record of how camps were managed and whether they met established conventions. While individual assessments varied, the inspection process itself formed part of the accountability framework governing prisoner of war treatment. Medical services were provided within the camps, with infirmaries handling routine illnesses and injuries. More serious cases could be transferred to external facilities under guard. Access to medical care was a requirement under the Geneva Convention, and records indicate that camp authorities tracked health conditions to prevent the spread of disease in close living quarters. Religious services were also permitted. Chaplains, either from among the prisoners or visiting clergy, conducted services according to denominational needs when possible. These gatherings offered a structured form of continuity for individuals separated from their home communities. As with other activities, participation was regulated but generally supported within camp guidelines. Mail correspondence played a central role in maintaining connections with families. Prisoners were allowed to send and receive letters, subject to censorship rules. Delivery could be slow, and content was restricted, but communication remained an important psychological link to home. News of conditions in Germany, including shortages and damage from bombing, reached prisoners through these channels, shaping their perception of the wider situation. Within this environment, the availability of food items, such as cake or Coca-Cola, did not stand alone. They were part of a broader system that aimed to provide sufficient nutrition and maintain order. The emotional reactions some prisoners later described can be understood in relation to accumulated stress, separation, and prior deprivation rather than as isolated responses to specific products. Post-war interviews and memoirs often reflect on these contrasts with a tone of measured reflection. Former prisoners frequently distinguished between the fact of captivity, which they did not minimize, in the material conditions they encountered in American camps. Their accounts describe a structured form of detention in which basic needs were met and certain aspects of civilian life remained visible. These recollections contribute to the historical record of how different nations implemented the laws of war. They also illustrate how policy decisions at the institutional level translated into daily experiences for individuals. Food quality, work assignments, and limited access to consumer goods were administrative details, yet they shaped personal memory in lasting ways. The presence of recognizable products such as Coca-Cola symbolized industrial capacity and distribution networks that continued to operate during wartime. For prisoners whose understanding of the United States had been filtered through propaganda and distance, these visible signs of economic stability could challenge prior assumptions. The effect was gradual and varied by individual, but it formed part of the broader experience of captivity. In examining these accounts, it is important to separate retrospective interpretation from documented policy. American camp administration was guided by formal regulations and international obligations. Within those parameters, daily life included meals that sometimes featured baked goods and beverages available through controlled purchase. The reactions these items prompted were personal responses to circumstances shaped by years of global conflict. Together, these elements provide a clearer picture of German prisoner of war life in the United States. Confinement, supervision, and uncertainty defined the overall framework. At the same time, adherence to established standards meant that food, work, and limited consumer access created an environment that differed in significant respects from what many prisoners had expected. When they were captured, transportation between camps followed established military procedures. Prisoners were moved by rail or truck under guard when labor needs shifted or when administrative consolidation required relocation. These transfers could introduce new routines and different local conditions, but the general regulatory framework remained consistent across the camp system. Work assignments were determined by agreements between military authorities and civilian employers. Agricultural labor remained the most common placement, particularly in regions facing acute shortages of farm workers. Prisoners harvested crops, processed food, and performed maintenance tasks that supported local production. Compensation, issued in scrip, was standardized according to rank and type of work, and its use was limited to approved purchases within the camp system. The economic dimension of prisoner labor was closely monitored. Employers paid the government for the use of prisoner workers, and the funds supported camp operations. This arrangement aimed to balance labor demand with regulatory oversight, ensuring that work conditions met established standards while contributing to wartime production. For prisoners, work provided structured activity and, in some cases, modest purchasing power within the camp economy. Disciplinary procedures existed, but were formalized. Infractions of camp rules could lead to temporary loss of privileges, reassignment, or confinement within camp facilities. Serious incidents were relatively uncommon, in part because predictable routines and basic provisions reduced sources of tension. Administrative records emphasize order and compliance as primary objectives in camp management. Information available to prisoners about the progress of the war was limited and filtered. Official notices, newspapers permitted by authorities, and word of mouth shaped their understanding of events. As the conflict moved toward its conclusion, uncertainty about the future became a central concern. Questions about repatriation, the condition of home regions, and post-war political arrangements remained unresolved until hostilities ended. When the war concluded in Europe, the process of repatriation did not occur immediately for all prisoners. Transportation logistics, political considerations, and the need for continued labor in some sectors delayed departures. During this interim period, camp routines continued, though the broader context had changed. Anticipation of return, combined with concern about conditions in Germany, influenced prisoner morale. Retrospective accounts often described the end of captivity as a gradual transition rather than a single moment. Administrative procedures, health evaluations, and documentation preceded transport home. For many, the contrast between structured camp life and the uncertainty awaiting them in a devastated country was stark. Memories of stable meals and small comforts were sometimes framed against reports of widespread shortages in post-war Europe. Historical analysis of German prisoner of war camps in the United States draws on military records, inspection reports, and personal testimonies. Together, these sources indicate a system designed to comply with international law while addressing domestic labor needs. Within that system, the provision of adequate food and the regulated availability of consumer goods formed part of routine administration rather than exceptional treatment. The accounts describing emotional reactions to cake or Coca-Cola should be understood within this documented framework. They reflect individual responses shaped by prior deprivation, confinement, and the unexpected contrast between expectation and experience. Such reactions add a human dimension to the institutional record without altering the underlying structure of camp policy. In summary, the experience of German prisoners of war in the United States was defined by regulated detention under the Geneva Convention, structured work programs, and material conditions that differed in notable ways from wartime life in Europe. Food, including occasional desserts and access to widely distributed beverages, were ordinary components of camp supply. The significance attributed to these items in later recollections underscores how daily material details can influence personal memory within the broader history of war and captivity. This account reflects documented conditions in American prisoner of war camps and the policies that shaped daily life within them. Individual experiences varied, but the broader framework was defined by international law, administrative regulation, and the material realities of the wartime United States. For more research-based examinations of lesser-known World War II history, subscribe to www.2studio and follow future releases.